My name is Jason. I'm with the NYU Votes Initiative, and I'm just here for a couple of quick reminders. Early voting has begun. It runs through this Sunday. This Tuesday is election day for the midterm elections. A lot at stake. The entire House of Representatives are up for grabs, and a third of the Senate is in contention. We ask you to do everything you can to help our students. Remember to make a plan to get to the poll, know the hours, know the location. If you're voting by absentee ballot, get those ballots in by the deadline. It's very important. All this information can be found at nyu.edu/nyu-votes. And we appreciate your help. NYU students have high registration numbers traditionally. It's the last step in getting to the poll or getting that vote in that sometimes we need the most help with. So anything you could do to reach your communities in these last 4 or 5 days will be extremely appreciated. And now I want to get to tonight's event. We're extremely honored to have President Hamilton here to introduce the program. And President Hamilton, please take it away.
Thank you very much, Jason, and good evening, everyone. I'm glad to see you all here this evening, because that means that you are not only interested in civic engagement, but you are also invested in civility, which is an ever-challenged notion in our modern political discourse. Tomorrow, I will be sending an email to the community encouraging all at NYU to be sure that they've met the proper deadlines to vote in next week's midterm elections, and if eligible, to plan accordingly, to mail back by the right deadline their absentee ballot, or to arrange their trip to the correct polling site. But we know that navigating the registration and voting process is only one aspect of this electoral season. The other, of course, is looking at the issues at stake, looking at how the candidates represent them, and deciding who is the right fit for your vote. In doing so, we often talk to our peers, our friends, our families. And in these conversations, we might find ourselves brought into a riveting political debate, which can be very healthy indeed. But sometimes those conversations can be the source of contention and conflict. Now, this has always been the case with politics, but it seems fair to say that we are seeing more polarization now than many of us can remember at any other time. And of course, therefore, the possibility of more heated discourse and more heated exchange, even argument. So I'm delighted that tonight we have two experts in conflict navigation and resolution who can offer us some guidance and perhaps some solutions for the next time that a political conversation, or really any type of conversation, takes a turn for the worse and becomes heated, becomes negative. Please, everyone, welcome Melissa Carter, Senior Director for the Center of Global Spiritual Life and Head of Mindfulness Education and Programs here at NYU. Melissa, take it away.
Thanks so much, President Hamilton. We really appreciate you being here. Thanks for kicking us off. So tonight, I want to first welcome you to Navigating Conflict in Our Democracy, a conversation with Megan Black and Melissa Carter. I'd love to tell you a bit about Megan Black. Megan Black is a Midwest-based organizer and trainer committed to race equity, inclusion, democracy, and the common good. Since 2010, Megan has worked with organizations like Inner Youth Faith Corps, Faith in Action, and Western States Center to navigate the spaces and tensions created by divisions in race, religion, and politics, with a particular focus on anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, anti-Black racism, and Christian dominance. She earned her undergraduate degree from the University of Notre Dame and a Master of Divinity degree from Vanderbilt University. Megan directs the Common Good program at Western States Center from her home in Kansas City, Missouri. Welcome, Megan.
Thanks, Melissa. I'm really excited to be here. I feel like the NYU community is kind of becoming a second home to me.
Oh, I love hearing that. And that's exactly how we want you to feel. So thank you for being with us and and jumping into conversation with me about quite a complex topic. So why don't I kick us off a little bit and give us some pre-context first. So it's election season, and we're actually seeing this with it being election season or not, a political landscape that is getting more fraught and divisive by the day. This can be isolating in a lonely way to experience, to navigate, to process the world, and try to find your way through. It's our hope today that each of you who are viewing this will walk away with at least one new tool or idea to help you navigate our current world climate so you can participate as a global citizen from a place of curiosity, empathy, and groundedness. So just a couple of things to let you know about tonight in the webinar. As Megan and I begin to speak, if you have any questions arise within you, please feel free to put them in the Q&A box on the right, and we will visit some of them at the end of our conversation. I also want to remind everyone that closed captioning is available should you need it. All right, ready to jump in?
Let's do it.
Okay. So Megan, we've been working together in our partnership with Western State Center and Global Spiritual Life on the Common Good cohort. Now, the Common Good cohort was designed to help students learn community tools to navigate this exact topic. So I want to first start very broadly, as it's important to us. Can you give your perspective on why it's crucial?
Yeah, I started my work in community organizing. I started out as an organizer on the ground in Kansas City, Missouri, which is where I currently live. And I was doing work deeply inside of the progressive movement. I was doing very political work with people who were very values aligned with me. And we were working to build a broad coalition to move some of our issues. And we were doing that in Missouri, which, as you can imagine, can be pretty challenging. It's politically, it's a very red state, and there's a lot of very divided kind of communities and ideas and beliefs here. And so this was my first kind of taste at what it looks like to do political work and to engage people around their deepest seated beliefs about who they are in this country and how this country and the city and the state should be run. And over time, what I have come to reflect on, especially after we had some wins and some losses, and it became harder and harder to look empathically at people who believe differently from me or who voted differently from me. It became harder and harder to feel compassion or to even be curious about people who had other beliefs. I realized that there was actually more and more of an imperative to do that. And there's a fantastic essay by Audre Lorde. It is on the transformation of silence into words and action. And in that essay, she talks about how she had this kind of close brush with death, and it opened up her mind and her imagination into the power of words as a means to bridge to others. And she said, in the end, it is not actually the differences between us that divide us, it is our silence with each other. And I have just found myself really leaning into that these differences feel so big and they feel often existential, but actually not talking about them is what makes those things feel so good. It's what makes those walls feel so thick. And so the more we have these conversations with each other and with people who don't believe or think the way that we do, the people that we feel some kind of conflict with, the thinner those walls get, hopefully they disappear, and we can find ways to be in productive relationship and have a civil society together. So for me, it is, I want us to move past the silence that divides us.
So let's talk about some of those ways. So how do we holistically address issues of conflict or coexist with those with whom we vehemently disagree with? And can you give an example, maybe give an example of when you've done that with curiosity and empathy in your own life?
Yeah, I think the kind of conflict and coexistence are a little bit, they're on the same path, right? Like you kind of run into them as you're walking down this journey of trying to figure out how to navigate conflict. And I think the more I have thought about my own experiences of this, the more I have come to appreciate how much of the conflict that we feel in our bodies, in the world right now, in our society right now, is mostly a feeling in our bodies, right? Like we tend to anticipate conflict before it actually happens. And we also tend to conflate conflict and disagreement and violence. And these are not all the same things. So right now we're kind of living in the aftermath of the attack on Nancy Pelosi's husband. This is not an example of conflict, right? That attack is an example of violence, and violence has to be met with consequences. So I would not characterize this as an example of political conflict. Same thing with the January 6th riot, right? Like these are acts of violence. These are not moments of conflict. Conflict is when we have two entities or more entities who are in disagreement with each other, not one who is attacking the other, but who are trying to find ways to build, who have kind of come to understand that the way that things aren't working, that our life as it has been is not working. And really what that does is it actually becomes an opportunity. I think about like couples who have to go to couples therapy, or who don't have to. Hopefully most couples are choosing to go to therapy, but couples who go to couples therapy, especially when conflict is arising, what they're realizing on their therapeutic journey is that we have to change the way that we are with each other. And for me, that's the opportunity that conflict creates. So I just wanted to be really clear about what we mean when we say conflict, right? We're not referring to violence, because that just has to be met, period, with consequences, ideally legal consequences. But when we are genuinely interacting with people, or when we're institutions who are interacting, who are finding ourselves in an untenable situation where we are unable to resolve, that is conflict. And that means we have to find a new way to live together. And I think, speaking personally, that means starting with ourselves. So it's one, recognizing, am I anticipating conflict, or am I genuinely in action right now? Because when I think about, like, I have family members, for example, who it's like, I think about going home for Thanksgiving, and if this were to come up, my heart rate already starts to get elevated, and I start to really feel like, oh, I really hope that this person, that this uncle or this cousin doesn't raise this issue, because it's just going to be a debacle. That's me anticipating a conflict without actually giving the other person a chance to weigh in and have a voice in it. And so the first kind of measure, the first step for me is putting things in perspective and acknowledging, I'm feeling some tension around this. What do I want to do with that feeling of tension? And what does it mean for the relationship I have with this person? And the other piece of it is really examining that relationship, because we often find ourselves or believe ourselves to be in conflict with people with whom we don't have a relationship. And in that case, that conflict is going to completely dead end, because that person has no reason to take your comments or your thoughts seriously, or to react to them. And you don't really have much of a right to ask questions of them or try to find a way to resolve that conflict. So the other way we move through this is by genuinely trying to build at least some kind of relational understanding of each other and the context in which people are coming from. I think about, I work with an organization here in Kansas City, and it's a social service agency that does really, really good work in historically Black community. And the people who are involved in it are very politically diverse, and we disagree on some things. And for example, after George Floyd was killed, there was this internal conversation about whether or not we wanted to release a statement and do some kind of internal work around this issue of race and racism as it was coming up broadly. And people came from all kinds of the political and social and cultural spectrum on this. And I found myself as a Black woman feeling very agitated by having to have this conversation, especially in this setting of like, all of us are together. So what I found was that if I actually kind of broke it down into a bite-sized piece and went to each person individually and asked them about how are they doing, and I had to kind of be honest with myself about some of these people, I don't know that I'm in the kind of place where I can have a productive conversation with them. So I had to tweak the conversation into something that I could handle without being myself, really like even deepening my own agitation. But it was the breaking people down into bite-sized individual persons and engaging them on a one-to-one basis where I could really engage their complexity that helped me lean into that space, hold the whole. And eventually we moved as an organization through the tension of that time and into a place where all of us felt like, even if it wasn't quite where, for example, I would have wanted us to be, we had at least made a step forward that was significant for that organization. For me, that gets into the coexistence piece, right? Like, we do have to find ways to live with each other. I think about this a little bit like climate change. Like, we don't have another planet to go to, and so we have to care for the planet that we're on. And it's the same thing with each other. Like, there's actually nowhere that we can go to escape the complexity of humanity. We have to find ways to coexist. And so this is an essential kind of body of work, and breaking it down into individual persons that we can engage on a one-to-one level so that we aren't overwhelmed by the kind of enormity of our differences makes a big difference.
So let's stick with this discussion around our relationship and orientation to conflict for a minute.
Yeah.
It feels easy to get clear on the individual level, what that relationship is and how do we do that when we look at it from a societal and structural level, when that fear that you're talking about can be so destabilizing, right? So we talk a lot about we shouldn't avoid conflict, which we're trained to do as a society. That keeps us out of growth. We've gotten the growth piece. It also keeps us out of healing. So I'm just curious, like, how do you as an individual in a world that has certain structures and certain systems and certain ways of being with this destabilizing fear approach conflict when there could be real live consequences?
I know, I genuinely struggle with this. I don't know that I have like a hard and fast answer. It feels much easier to break it down to the granular and to do the individual work, right? Like, if I just do this in myself, then it helps me in interpersonal interactions. But then we think about how deeply impactful our institutions are and how important it is for our institutions to also do this really, really deep work. And so I think this is also where I come back to Audre Lorde a little bit and to the importance of using our voice and transforming that silence into action. And I think it's about how are we actively engaging with the institutions that shape our societies and our lives, whether it's our school, whether it's our city council, whether it's a local community organization, a church, a congregation. What are the institutions around us that are shaping our lives, that are either various media outlets that might be perpetuating or participating in this conflict, and how can we influence the ones that we're connected to? And I thought I went to Nicole. I had Nicole Hannah-Jones came to Kansas City recently, and she talked at the end of her presentation about how the enormity of the work in front of us can feel really paralyzing. And all that we need to do, really the first thing we need to do, and maybe the only thing we need to do, is pick somewhere to start. And I think that's really, really good advice, because all of us hopefully are connected somewhere. We're connected to some kind of institution, to some kind of entity or collective of people that we can go to and start using our voice and saying, hey, I want us to take on this approach, or I want us to share this message, or I want us to ideally build this relationship. I'm working right now with a leader out in Idaho who is Latino, Hispanic, and is a leader in the Hispanic community, a small Hispanic community in Idaho. And he's realizing he wants to build a bridge to the Jewish community in his state, because they're facing some concerted efforts from white nationalist actors in Idaho. And so he's realizing I need to find some way to move my institutions and my community organizations into relationship with Jewish communities and Jewish institutions so that we can collectively work to create space for genuine dialogue and for conflict that's not violence, because what we're actually really worried about is violence. So I love that instinct towards bridge building, and I love that instinct toward using our voice inside of larger institutions to help build bridges between us. I think that's kind of where it needs to start.
Thank you for that. Our work together, we talk a lot about a practice of coexistence, and in that coexistence is conflict. And that coexistence is needed for boundaries, and that coexistence is needed for mutual empathy and curiosity. I really enjoyed hearing you speak about this like practice of coexistence. Do you mind sharing with us a bit more of what that means and why it's so important to navigating conflict?
Yeah. Well, I'll tell a little bit of a story of a conflict that kind of turned into coexistence that I really appreciated. I was facilitating a pretty kind of raw space between two communities who were very different from each other, had very different experiences in the world and of each other. And it was a group of clergy, of religious leaders. And we were working through a really gnarly issue. And I was the one who was facilitating. And I had just kind of started to establish a baseline relationship with each of these people. There were maybe 20 people in the room. And I said something that really triggered one of the clergy. And he ends up, for context, I'm like 6 feet tall. So this was quite an effort on his part because he was significantly shorter than me. But he ends up kind of leaping up and getting in my face. And he's like screaming in my face about this. And he's a white man. I'm a Black woman. I was immediately kind of like put on edge by this interaction. And it shut me down completely in the middle of this facilitated conversation because I had this person just almost spitting in my face about this thing. And I had these kind of internal conflict. I was kind of navigating an internal conflict of, is this my fault? And how dare he? Like, who does he think he is? And I'm having to process all of this in front of this group of people. And I happened to have some co-facilitators. I was very grateful. And I ended up taking a moment to pause and turn to those co-facilitators. And I just very transparently said to them, I need a moment. I need a moment to really process this in front of the whole room. Like it was just, neither of us could continue. And so I let him be human and I let myself be human in that moment and ask for help. And my co-facilitators came around me and they helped me kind of move through my own physiological reaction to that moment. And then once I was able to kind of come to myself, we then turned back to the group because we realized that this was a thing that was affecting everyone, that this interaction had actually spun out beyond just the two of us. And we were able to move through it as a group. And then later on, I went up to that clergy person and I said, hey, let's talk about this. Like, let's try to form a connection and try to understand what happened here. And we had a really productive conversation. And we were both able to say, this is where I felt like I kind of lost control. Here's what happened. I came to understand what triggered him. And it was so clarifying for me. And it honestly helped me grow a little bit as well. And that turned into a form of a way to coexist, right? Like that moment of conflict actually turned that whole really challenging space around. And we were able to come out of it the next day with people feeling like, this is the most progress I've been able to make in a space like this. I feel seen. I feel like I see these people differently. I understand more of what's playing out between us. And I'm excited to keep bridging and keep finding ways for us to work together. And I think it's that. So for me, it came down to one, finding a way to manage and regulate myself. And then two, giving the person who I was struggling to share the space with an opportunity to be vulnerable and to share themselves so I could then accept them. So I think that is a big piece of coexistence. And the other piece I'll say here is the importance of curiosity, that we have to find ways to wonder about what's going on with people. In our current political climate, when we see people who hold beliefs that are different from ours, we kind of immediately paint them with a broad brush and we assign what I would describe as kind of a caricature to them, like a cartoon figure. And we say, this person is that. They are a so-and-so voter. They are a woke whatever. And then what that does is it totally erases our ability to really get at the complexity. Brene Brown, how does Brene Brown describe herself? She's more than a motivational speaker. She's anyways.
Storyteller.
Storyteller, great, thank you.
Or she's a researcher. I'm not really sure. Yeah.
She said something once about how, we should try to assume that people are doing their best. And I think when it comes to like spaces of real conflict, again, this is not violence, right? But for people who happen to hold different beliefs from us and are trying to figure things out, what does it look like for us to assume that they're doing their best? And for me, what that looks like is that I assume that they're working from some kind of value set that means a lot to them. And then what that does is it makes me wonder, what are those values and how do they understand them? Because I bet some of the values that they would claim are values I would also claim, but what it looks like for them and what it means to them must be different. There's like a translation that needs to happen. And so I've started seeing the work of coexistence a little bit as the work of kind of learning a new language, of like finding a way to communicate with each other about these fundamentals of who we are and what we envision for the world.
Yeah, I appreciate this so much because I appreciate that you keep making the distinction between violence and conflict, because I often see in my work and in my practice that I talk about coexistence, or I talk about being curious of one another, or addressing conflict, navigating conflict head on, right? Talking with people we vehemently disagree with. And I think there's this sentiment that it's a passive, we just want everyone to get along, and let's just, we're all in this together. And I actually don't see it that way. I actually see it as really intense, difficult work to address conflict as it's happening, right? Knowing that there's so much going on in your body. And I know we're going to get to, self-regulation and co-regulation later, and you just gave me a great scenario to play with. But I think it's so important to really know that when we're coming into a conversation like this, we are really truly talking about conflict and not violence. Like that's red stop, like not acceptable. Harm is not acceptable.
Yep.
And in conflict, we can grow and we can heal and we can understand each other a bit more. And it doesn't mean at the end of the conflict that we're going to have resolution or that we're even going to agree. And I think when we try to go in from a place of resolution, we block ourselves from actually seeing the human being in front of us.
Yep.
So I really appreciate that distinction and all that you've been sharing. I want to switch topics just a little bit.
Great.
So liberation, justice, and democracy each have their own sets of conflicts, right? Ranging in nuance and complexity. Some are internal to movement spaces, while others are more broadly engaged. These three separate roads are interwoven, full stop. How do we address the internal conflict within ourselves and then external conflict between each other when we may feel one or all of them are failing us or at stake?
Yeah. It is a big question. You're going to have to help me figure this out. Maybe you and I can tease it out together, because this is one I'm still actively working through.
Yeah.
I actually don't know that I would agree that it's full stop, that they're woven together. I think that democracy has been, and at least is right now for the foreseeable future, one of the primary ways that people have been working toward liberation and freedom. But I don't necessarily agree that that is a requirement. Like, I think probably there are ways to work toward liberation and maybe even freedom that are outside of a democracy. But what we have right now is democracy. And I think that's a very good thing. Like, democracy, I think, has been, on the whole, very, very important for the kinds of equity, equality, and opportunity that many of us have been able to benefit from over recent decades. And it's also been, American democracy has been messy and also harmful in many ways. So I think about this. I remember at some point in my organizer journey, I got really sick of how much we talked about liberation. Like, it felt like it was just our go-to word whenever we were trying to motivate people and rev people up, and it felt incredibly unspecific. I never knew what people actually meant when they said that. We just constantly said it. I had some sense of what it meant for me, but the more that I did this work across lines of difference with people who did not look like me or share my experience, the more I realized that I actually think we have different ideas of what liberation is, and we're not having a conversation about that. So we're all just kind of like hoping that we're going to end up in the same place, but I don't actually know that we're going to get there if we don't start talking more explicitly. So I have this kind of problem sometimes with the term of liberation. And I will say too, as someone who is theologically trained, my professional degree is a seminary degree, it's in theology. And so I tend to think of liberation almost as a spiritual quest, a spiritual endeavor, and not one that we can certainly and ought to do collectively. I don't think it's an individual journey, although I hope people do journey it individually, but I think it is a collective endeavor. I just don't think we quite know what we mean when we say that. And that it gets in the way, then it becomes a way for us to smooth over some of the differences that are actually worth talking about. So we throw out liberation instead of getting at the specificity of what that means for Black Americans who are the descendants of enslaved people, or we smooth over the specificity of what that means for Jewish Americans, white Jewish Americans who came over from Europe and Russia and were fleeing pogroms and all of these things, right? Or we brush over what that means for Indigenous people, for Native Americans who have been here. I just think liberation bears some more fruitful conversations so that we understand what we mean when we say it, and it gives us the chance then to maybe have some friction about what that looks like, some tension, some conflict that we can grow from and lean into. Freedom for me feels a little bit more aligned. I think freedom we have a little bit more of a sense of, at least in, that's a politically delineated idea now. What freedom means to the left is very different than what freedom means to the right. And so I am concerned about the way in which we use that term to actually further division amongst us, rather than really trying to kind of understand why is this notion of freedom so central to your self-understanding. That conversation just isn't happening enough. So those are some of the ways in which I start to kind of tease those things out, but I'm curious about what that has looked like for you.
Yeah,
how do you
well, first I want to also just give an example to the audience that Megan and I just had a disagreement. Right? It didn't stop the conversation. I actually agree with her. And I was talking about in the context of democracy and not outside of it. So I could have offered that clarity. And I say that very vulnerably just to showcase that in that moment, I could have shut down. I could have just been like, why is she doing that?
How dare you?
How dare you? And that would have then led to a very different conversation for the rest of you to view. And I think it's important to point that out because we got so much out of it. And I was like, oh, I should have clarified that point a bit more, right? Simple, then move on. I think when it comes to liberation, justice, and democracy, I feel similarly that I think about justice too, right? That are we going to have balanced justice for everyone? Yeah. And can that occur? And is that actually something that we can create in this world? I don't have the answer to that, because I haven't had the roadmap of proof that can happen. But I do believe that we are bound up in one another's liberation. And if we live in a society that was evolving democracy, how do we find a way to have more balanced conversation around each of the three and how each of the three affect us individually, right? So how lack of liberation or an over-exhaustive use of justice or a lack of invitation into what democracy could be for me may be very different than the next person. And if I don't understand how you're experiencing those three, it's going to be really difficult for me to understand your work that is either needed to be done or you've done, or that value set that you talked about earlier.
Yeah. I think I heard freedom and you said justice, and I appreciate you bringing that up because justice for me feels distinct in the sense that there are people in this country who are parched for justice, who are desperately crying out. I would say that I come from those people. In some ways, I am one of those people. And it belongs to all of us. We each deserve it. And we have not yet found a way as a country. And I think I'll speak from my Kansas City community, even on the super granular level of cities, municipalities, to have a meaningful conversation about how to actually be a society and a place where justice can flow like a river. It just doesn't exist here. And the way that we each that for me feels so much connected to the relationships that we have with each other and our sense of accountability to each other. And that is such a critical way for us to have conversations about the differences that exist between us, because justice is a thing that has been missing for a very long time from this place.
And it's where the curiosity piece comes in really clearly, right? Like, how are you experiencing this world through the identities in the body in which you exist in, related to liberation, justice, and democracy? I mean, that would be an amazing conversation to have with anybody that'd be willing to go there with you and share their experience, right?
And if I can be vulnerable here, I would say too, it's a conversation, I think of myself as a bridge builder, so I take it upon myself to go out and have these conversations with other people. And that question of justice is one that I feel very hungry for someone to have to ask of me. Like, if I were to say, I want you to, I want someone to bridge to me, I would want them to bridge around this question of justice. And that hunger for someone to just open that door for us, have that conversation with us, that's a very real dynamic. And I just want to own the heaviness sometimes of having to be the person who is doing the work of building the bridge, who is the one who is practicing curiosity. It is not just a skill you developed. And I don't want to call it a burden, because I also see it as liberating, but it is certainly a heaviness.
Yeah. And, I want to open this up to the viewers of what's that question, that burning desire for you of, I wish someone would just ask me this.
Yeah.
Right. So if you all want to jot that down for yourselves, and maybe next time you're in community or in connection with someone, and really ask them that and say, hey, this is something I really always wanted someone to ask me. Right. And if they're willing to go there with you and listen, then maybe ask them in return and learn something new from each other. So let's talk about bridge building a bit.
Yay.
I know it's your favorite topic. I also want to remind everyone, go ahead and get your questions in. We're going to be wrapping up soon so that we can answer some of your questions. So get your questions in the Q&A box and I will read them out to everyone. So we've seen attempts in our student leadership, and you've seen it with our students as well, and university initiatives, and really out anywhere in the world that is doing this work, to be a bridge builder, to be a part of the conversation when navigating conflict and democracy. How do you define bridge building? Because I don't think we've said that yet. I don't think we've named that in this conversation yet. And what do you believe is needed to approach it from a place of self and collective care?
Yeah, the Venn diagram is really helpful for me in terms of kind of imaging this, but I see bridge building as, first of all, a practice of meeting people where they are. It is not the actual bridge. It's the acknowledgement that there are two places, right? That you are building a bridge between two places. And so bridge building is allowing folks to be in the place that they are, understanding that place, mapping out where is the right place to, land this bridge, and then really figuring out what kind of materials we need to actually get there. So what does it take to get to where this person is, and to provide a path for that person to come to where I am. And that is typically in the context of some kind of meaningful relationship, where there's curiosity, there's sharing, there's a desire to understand, there's the cultivation of a kind of shared language. That is the work that I see of bridge building. I love it when it's two people who are actively working to build a bridge to each other. It doesn't have to be. It can be one person who is making an effort to try to understand the other. This happens a lot with me and like Uber drivers. Every now and then I'll get into a political conversation with an Uber driver and I'm like, let's build a bridge here because you're saying some wild things. And it's just this really fun practice of getting to understand why people say what they say, what their core values are, et cetera. I don't know if there's anyone listening who is like a fan of the Settlers of Catan, but I kind of think of it a little bit like a Catan game board where you have these like little squares where people are and you're finding ways to build roads between them so that folks can move back and forth. And like I said, that's generally in the context of relationship, curiosity, open conversation. And what was the second part of your question? Sorry, go ahead.
People doing this work, right? Like bridge building can be exhausting,
Super exhausting.
And sometimes it's always on, let's say if someone might feel isolated in it and like it's always on me to do the bridge building.
Yeah.
what guidance do you recommend to community members who are doing the work from a place of care? How should they
Yeah.
take care of themselves?
I will say, I went through like a 2-year a dark night of the soul, as they say in Catholic mysticism. I went through a period of, I was doing some bridging work between two communities, one of which I was a member. I was a part of this community, and things got really hard. And I learned more about the differences between us than I wanted to know, or than I was even prepared to learn at the time. Like, I think fundamentally going into that practice, this was very early in my bridge building work, I believed that we were more similar than we are different. And this experience challenged that on a fundamental level. And it sent me into a little bit of a spiritual spiral and actually a state of depression for a while that required a therapeutic intervention to emerge from. And I realized coming out of that, that I had to find a way to care for myself first, and to know my own boundaries, and to know when to push those boundaries. Because I had to realize too that those boundaries are good because they protect me, but they cannot be rock solid, because then I don't ever grow. Like, I can't hide behind my boundaries. It's okay that things get hard and that they get challenging and that I need help to get through them. But I do need to at least have an understanding of, I have pushed myself too hard. I need to build in some time to recover and to ground myself again. And so the first thing I always say is, have a care for your boundaries, and find people and practices that will help you maintain them. But don't ever build those boundaries so high and so strong that you can't get out from behind them, or that they can't be moved. Because you're asking other people to move, and so you have to also be willing to move. And I think the second part of your question was about that burden of being the one to always do it. And this is a tough one. We've talked about this before. I don't think all of us are called to be bridge builders. And I think there are people for whom this work makes a ton of sense. I come from a biracial family in Iowa. I have had to build bridges between different, extraordinarily distinct communities my entire life. And so in some ways, this is an act of survival for me. And so I carry that burden on because I have to. But I think there are other people whose job it is to kind of hold down the communities that we're building bridges between, right? And I don't necessarily need you to be the one building the bridge. I need you to be the one helping define that community, so that we know where we're going and we know what's there when we reach it. And so I think there's also this having to do this kind of honest assessment of, am I called to this? Do I have the heart for this? And what am I willing to give? I do think, I will say with this caveat, not everyone is called to kind of do or needs to be doing the kind of perpetual work of bridge building. I do think all of us are able to cultivate curiosity about other people. And I actually think that's essential. I don't know if this is true or not. I don't know if this holds up in the field of history, but I suspect that what we're doing right now in this country has never really been done before in human history, in terms of the amount of diversity that we're trying to hold together in this society, like the extraordinary breadth of human experience that is all trying to find a seat at the table in this world, in this country, and I actually think broadly in this world. I don't know that we as humans have ever had to do this before this way. And so we all have to kind of keep stretching and pushing ourselves to figure out how to do that. And that means we have to be willing to cultivate curiosity and generosity with the people around us.
And I also want to add in, from the care perspective, for people who are doing bridge building work, a barometer that I always check in with myself is, am I being of service right now? Right?
Yes.
Like, am I so burnt out? Am I so dysregulated? Am I so exhausted that actually my presence and then my attempt at bridge building is hurting the bridge, right? Is actually taking bricks away from the bridge.
Well, oh, go. Sorry, I didn't mean to. Well, I just wanted you to talk more about the emotional regulation piece, because this
Yeah.
is language I learned from you and I really appreciate. Yeah, I
Yeah.
wonder if you would share.
Sure. So that goes right into Megan and we often talk about like how do you actually do an assessment of yourself to say, am I available for this work right now? Right? Am I available to bridge build? Am I available to address conflict? Am I available to enter into a difficult conversation? And it's really having the wherewithal of yourself to say yes or no. Actually respect the no if there's a no. And so I wanted to bring up the idea of this self-regulation, and your example earlier about the clergyman who got in your face and was yelling at you and you became dysregulated. There's actually something from a neuroscience perspective that's happening in your body that's adding to this. That's why we feel things in our body, because our nervous systems are trying to protect us. So for example, in that moment, you had your primal stem of your brain get activated. And your primal stem of your brain can't tell the difference between an actual crisis and a honking horn outside, right? So to that, everything is alarming. Everything is crisis. Everything is danger, 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 danger. And so the primal stem clicks off, and I'm not really talking about the triune brains. I'm only talking about 3 parts of the brain right now. And it activates a part of the brain called the limbic brain, which holds all of our feelings and our emotions and our memories. And then it also activates the frontal neocortex of the brain, which allows us to be analytical and rational and see another person's point of view. And then the back lobe of the frontal cortex is where we can access empathy. But what happens is the limbic brain has so much more neural circuitry than that frontal neocortex. So it turns on first. So that's that emotion we feel. That's that initial response of, oh, how dare you, or this, that, and the other, right? And closing off and, fight, flight, or freeze. Which one do you pick? Does your body pick in the moment to protect you? And so this is where that invitation of slowing down and recognizing I'm dysregulated. I'm in my limbic brain right now. I'm not going to be able to address this clergyman, which is what you did. You said, I need to pause. I need to take a break, right? I need to regulate. And then I can come back to him when I'm back, when that analytical mind has turned back on and it's caught up, and they can now work together, and I can share my story and be available to analyze and be rational and hear his, right? That may not happen. If harm is being committed, that you need to, red light, right? I have that stoplight of emotion. So I always say, invite people into that pause with you if you're in conflict. And I use a stoplight of emotion of, if you're in a moment, and let's say you and I are having a conflict and I'm getting really dysregulated, I might say, hey, Megan, I'm having a really hard time hearing you right now. I'm getting a little dysregulated. Can we take a few deep breaths together? Because that's going to actually calm my nervous system. And now you have an option at that moment to join me in that invitation and say yes or say no. So let's say you said yes, yellow light, right? I asked us to slow down. Now we're going to go back to green, and we're going to keep going, right? You might be like, no, and keep spitting in my face and yelling at me. And it's escalating, red light. I do not need to engage. And that is my boundary, right? So I think it's really important to understand that, like, it's not just our, we're randomly getting upset. You may have experienced the same type of treatment from someone your entire life. That experience, your entire life, is now in that experience you're having with that clergyman, right? Yes. And so we need to take a moment to come back to that present moment so we can say, oh, I need a moment. Let me come back to the ground. And I want to stay curious. I want to hear you. But we have to have that awareness of ourselves to be able to do that.
Yes. And the fact that we can cultivate that awareness, I love that. It helps so much, because I'm like, yes, that's exactly what happened. And I love that for me, the place where I get hope, the thing that kind of pulled me back from my spiritual crisis was that we can cultivate that awareness, that neurological response doesn't have to be the end of the interaction, that we can actually transform it into something productive and meaningful. And so I think that's beautiful. And I really appreciate the framework.
No problem. Thank you for asking me. I love talking about the brain. So I want to get to some questions that are in the box. We have just a little bit of time left. We have one here is, thank you for this presentation. As someone committed to dialogue, how can I try to encourage folks to engage who are conflict averse? Great question. I often find that people in these conversations are already the ones doing the work, and I want to expand the tent.
Yeah.
Hmm.
I think that becomes it's a little bit of expanding the range of what you're trying to do. So we go in and we think, I need to have this conversation with this uncle about this political belief that this uncle has. But actually, if they're not willing to engage, or that's not where they are, then that's not what you need to do, because you're moving them out of a space where they're comfortable. And you're doing it on your own agenda, right? You're not letting them kind of articulate their own. And so actually what we need to do is go in and say, I want to spend some time with this uncle. And it can be just as easy as that, as taking away the urgency of our own agenda and allowing for the need to create time with this person to like let things service. I feel like my words are not making sense here, but instead of going in with this sense of, I'm going to engage this person in a conversation where we're going to bridge our differences, you would instead go in and say, I'm going to create some time with this person so that we can build trust and relationship between us, in the hopes that eventually they'll feel vulnerable enough to go there with me. But we cannot demand that people do this with us because we feel like we're called to it, or we have to do it. We have to be willing to let them have a voice as well. So bridge building is not about running the show. It's about creating the conditions where people can have that eventually. And part of creating the conditions is sometimes going really, really slow and just hanging out, kayaking one day, and then seeing where things go from there.
Absolutely. And I also want to add in that sometimes people don't want to be in relationship with you, right? And we have to be willing to let that go. And that disappointment is great. It's grand, right? That disappointment of like, oh, I really want to be in conversation. This person's avoiding the conflict. They may not be ready to, and we have to just respect that. And also, that may not be the person that this conversation is supposed to be happening with. I want to just give both sides that happens too. So last question from the audience, and then I'll wrap us up. I have one more question for you. Hopefully you can answer this in 1 minute.
Okay.
This question is for you. I appreciate you sharing your frustration with the word liberation in social justice spaces. In my own experience, I've discovered people mean different things by those terms as well. Can you say a little bit more how your theology background has allowed you to invite more complexity to a collective understanding of liberation or justice in 1 minute or less?
Very, very, okay, in 1 minute or less. What I loved about my theology studies was that it broke open for me the breadth of visionary thought out there about what liberation can and should look like. I was raised with one very specific notion of what that is. And through my theological studies, I came to realize that there have been thousands of years of people in parts of the world I've never been to who have also been visioning this. And actually what that does is it creates this beautiful tableau for us to start going back to and spending time with and trying to understand and to see ourselves in the lineage of. And so spending time exploring each other's traditions, that it's so hard to really fully encapsulate how essential religious and spiritual traditions are to the human experience and human life. Spending time in those and allowing them all to percolate and find some room in your psyche and in the psyche of the organizations you're a part of is really critical for building a collective sense of liberation. One last thing, it doesn't necessarily have to be a collective sense of liberation. It's okay if our senses of our understandings don't fully agree. What I see is our future, what I hope, if I were to write like an Afrofuturist sci-fi novel, it would be this kind of constant process of negotiating with each other. There's never an answer. There's only like us being able to negotiate from positions of equity and power with each other. And that for me is exciting and deeply human.
Thank you for that. So final question, and then I'm going to wrap us up. I noticed there's a tension between elections having real consequences and them being a regular part of our civic life. And what would your guidance be for those of us trying to instill this practice of coexistence, curiosity, and facing conflict head on in our lives? How do we do it in a sustainable way? Knowing that it's a lifelong practice and it's part of our civic, and I would say human life, right? Like, I don't think it's separate of us. It's going to be there constantly because our well-being, our human rights are tied up and bound into it.
Yeah, I think it's the perspective shift. I think each election cycle, this year we've had Roe v. Wade come down. We have affirmative action in college campuses. We have really critical things that feel very, very real playing out in as a direct kind of consequences of how people vote. So our election cycles, each election feels deeply, deeply urgent in a way that can really spur a sense of despair if the election doesn't go your way, or on the flip side, a kind of overwhelming sense of like elation that may be misplaced. And I think for me, it's threading the needle. It's like finding some perspective of this democracy has been around for a couple hundred years. We've been holding elections every 2 years for that period of time. The needle keeps kind of like fluctuating like this. It's almost like the stock market, right? It goes up and it goes down. And we have to find a way to hold the tension of the real impact of these elections and the long work that we're about, and spiritually and also politically in relationship with each other. The King quote about Martin Luther King, that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice, really comes to mind when I think about this, that I cannot let despair or even an overly generated sense of elation influence too much of my emotional state going into and coming out of an election, because the work does not end at that election. There is more work to do. And that work for me is, yes, getting people out to vote. And in the meantime, it is building bridges between us so that when the next one comes around, maybe we start to build a more inclusive democracy.
Megan, thank you so much for just being so open and vulnerable and being in dialogue. I could talk to you all night. Unfortunately, we have to close here, but I want to thank everyone for attending. This event was recorded and will be available for viewing in a few days. Please continue to take care of yourself and each other. We must face what is so we can move forward. And I want to remind everyone to get out and vote. We need your voice, not just in conversation, we need it in the ballot box. And many blessings to you all. Thank you for being here and thank you for caring. Good night, everyone.